Good morning. How are you? It is super, super early. Everybody's asleep in my house, and I am awake. And I thought maybe we could read another chapter of the book before anybody wakes up. I have my coffee so that I can read to you and make a little bit of sense. So if you want to snuggle up, I'll read another chapter. You might have to bear with me. My brain and my mouth might just be waking up too, so I might make a little bit of might have like some errors as I read, but we'll do it together, right? Because that's what reading's all about. This is chapter 3, A Birthday Surprise. Pencils down, Mrs. Peters ordered from the front of the classroom. Her students were taking a math test, and she had been watching them like a prison guard the entire time. Pass your test to the front. Connor looked at the test as if it were written in ancient hieroglyphics. Now, hieroglyphics are the way ancient Egyptians used to write. So instead of writing the letters of the alphabet to make words, to make sentences, they would have symbols and they would carve those symbols into stone, maybe the side of a stone wall or onto some, other sort of like the sides of buildings. So when you go to the art museum and you see those large slabs of stone that have pictures in them, that would be ancient hieroglyphics. Most of his answers were blank, and he had just scribbled around the others, making it look like he tried. He said a little prayer to himself, and he passed the test forward with the others. The tests were all passed to Alex, who stacked them in a neat pile for Mrs. Peters. She always felt so refreshed after taking a test, especially one as simple as the one that this had been. I'm going to scrub it. Look, I have my Ravens PJs on. I have my Maryland shirt on. It's just like a Maryland day. Her brother's test caught her eye since it was the one with the least amount of writing on it. Alex knew Connor always tried his best at school, but his best never seemed to be good enough. She looked back at him, wishing she could help. And then it occurred to her maybe she could. Alex looked up at Mrs. Peters and saw that she was busy looking at the notes in her lesson plans. Would her teacher notice if Alex quickly filled in a couple answers for her brother? Was Alex even capable of doing something so blatantly wrong? Was it considered cheating if you were doing it on someone else's test? Would the gracious gesture cancel out the offense in the grand scheme of things? Alex was prone to overthinking everything, so she just did it. She quickly filled in some of her brother's answers, making her handwriting slightly sloppier than it usually was, and she handed the stack of tests to Mrs. Peters. It was the most spontaneous thing she had ever done. "Thank you, Mrs. Bailey," Mrs. Peters said, making eye contact with her. Alex felt like the pit of her stomach had fallen out of her body. The excitement she had felt from her impulse was now overshadowed by guilt. Mrs. Peters had always trusted her. How could she do something so juvenile? Should she confess what she had just done? Oh, what was the punishment for her crime? Would she feel this guilty for the rest of her life? She looked back at her brother, and Connor let out a long but quiet sigh, and Alex sensed her brother's sadness and embarrassment. She could feel his hopelessness as if it was her own. The critical wheels in Alex's head stopped turning. She knew she had done the right thing, not as a student, but as a sister. "I want you all to get out your homework from last night," Mrs. Peters commanded, "and I would like you to briefly present your work in front of the class." The teacher regularly surprised the class with impromptu presentations to keep them on their toes. She took a seat on the stool in the back of the room, uncomfortably close to Connor's seat so she could keep an eye on his consciousness. One by one, the students presented their assignments to the class. Besides a boy who thought Jack and the Beanstalk was about an alien abduction, and a girl who claimed Puss in Boots was an early example of animal cruelty, all the students seemed to have interpreted the tales correctly. "It was so hard to choose just one fairy tale to write about," Alex said as she animatedly presented her 7-page paper to the class. "So I selected the story, the theme in which is presented in virtually every fairy tale and every story ever written. Cinderella." Her excitement was not shared by her peers. Many people have issues with Cinderella, saying it has an anti-feminist element, and Alex continued. But I think that's completely ridiculous. Cinderella is not about a man saving a woman. It's about karma. Most of the class began daydreaming about other things, and Mrs. Peters was the only person in the room who seemed even slightly interested in what Alex had to say. Think about it, Alex went on. Even after years of constant abuse from her stepmother and her stepsisters, Cinderella remained a good person with high hopes. She never stopped believing in herself and in the good of the world, and although she married the prince in the end, Cinderella always had inner happiness. Her story shows that even in the worst of situations, even when it seems that no one in the world appreciates you, as long as you have hope, everything can get better. Alex let her mind linger on what she had said. She questioned the last point she had made in her presentation. Was that really what Cinderella was about? Or is what she just needed Cinderella to be about? Why do you think that she needs Cinderella to be about the idea that even when there seems to be no one in the world appreciates you, as long as you have hope, it can get better? What do we think about that for a minute? Like, what do we already know about Alex and what she's going through in her life, what she and Connor are going through? Why is it that you think that she needs to have hope that everything is going to get better? Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. Very well said, Mrs. Peters said, when the closest thing to a smile her face was capable of making. Thank you for your time, Alex said and nodded to the class. It's your turn, Mr. Bailey, the teacher announced. She was sitting so close to him that he could feel the warm breath from her nostrils on the back of his neck. Connor went to the front of the classroom, dragging his feet as if they were encased in concrete. He had never had trouble talking in front of class, but he'd rather be anywhere in the world rather than presenting something in front of a teacher. Alex gave him an encouraging nod. I chose the boy who cried wolf, Connor said, going against his sister's advice from the day before. Alex slumped in her seat, and Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes. This was very disappointing. I know you're all thinking I went with the easiest one, Connor said. Except, reading it again, I didn't think the story is about the importance of honesty. I think it's about high expectations. Alex and Mrs. Peters both raised an eyebrow. Where was he going with this? Sure, the boy was a brat. I can't deny that, Connor continued, gesturing to the half-page paper he'd written. But can you blame him for having a little fun? I mean, clearly his village was having a bit of a wolf problem, and everyone was stressed out about it, and he's just a kid. I mean, did they really expect him to be perfect all the time? His presentation may not have been the best, but it certainly was catching the class's attention. And it makes me wonder, why was no one watching this kid? Connor added. I mean, maybe if his parents had kept an eye on him, he wouldn't have been eaten. I think the story is trying to tell us to keep an eye on our kids, especially if they're pathological liars. Thank you. Connor never tried to be funny. He was just painfully honest about his thoughts and opinions. This honesty always amused his classmates, but never his teacher. Thank you, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters said sharply. You may sit down now. Connor knew he'd blown it. He took his seat and resumed his position under his teacher's cold stare and warm breath. Why did he even bother trying anymore? It wasn't the end of the school day unless Connor left feeling completely worthless. There was only one person who was capable of making him feel better when he felt this way. Connor only wished he was still around. Mr. Bailey always knew when his son needed to talk to him. It didn't have anything to do with observation or intuition, but with location. Occasionally, Mr. Bailey would get home from work and find his son sitting up in the oak tree in the front yard with a contemplative look on his face. Connor, Mr. Bailey would ask, approaching the tree. Everything all right, bud? Mm-hmm, Connor would mumble. You sure? Mr. Bailey would ask. Yeah, Connor would say unconvincingly. He wasn't as vocal about his troubles as his sister was, but you could see it in his face. Mr. Bailey would climb up the tree and have a seat on the branch next to his son and coax out what was troubling him. Are you sure you don't want to talk about it? Mr. Bailey would continue. Did something happen at school today? Connor would nod his head. I got a bad grade on a test, he admitted on one occasion. Did you study for it? His father asked. Yes, Connor said. I studied really hard, Dad, but it's just no use. I'm never as smart as Alex. His cheeks turned bright red with embarrassment. Connor, let me fill you in on something that took me a long time to learn, Mr. Bailey said. The women in your life are always going to seem smarter. It's just the way it is. I've been married to your mother for 13 years, and I still have trouble keeping up with her. You can't compare yourself to others. I'm stupid, Dad, Connor said, his eyes filling with tears. I find that hard to believe, Mr. Bailey said. It takes intelligence to be funny and tell a good joke, and you're the funniest kid I know. Humor doesn't help with history or math, Connor said. It doesn't matter how hard I try in school. I'm always going to be the dumb kid in class. Connor's face went white and expressionless. He stared off into nothing, so ashamed of himself that it hurt. Luckily for him, Mr. Bailey had an encouraging story for every situation. Connor, have I ever told you the legend about the walking fish? Mr. Bailey asked him. He looked up at his father. The walking fish? Connor asked. Dad, no offense. I don't think your stories is going to make me feel better this time. All right, suit yourself, Mr. Bailey said. A few moments passed and Connor's curiosity got the best of him. All right, you can tell me about the walking fish, Connor said. Mr. Bailey's eyes lit up as they always did just before he was about to tell a story. Connor could tell this was going to be a good one. Once upon a time, there was a large fish who lived in a lake by himself, Mr. Bailey told him. Every day, the fish would watch longingly as a boy from the village nearby would play with all the horses and dogs and squirrels on land. If a dog is going to die in the story, Dad, Connor interrupted. You know, I hate stories where the dogs die. Let me finish, Mr. Bailey went on. One day, a fairy came to the lake and granted the fish a wish. That's random, Connor said. Why do fairies always just show up and do nice things for people they don't know? Employment obligation, Mr. Bailey shrugged. But for argument's sake, let's say she dropped her wand in the lake and the fish retrieved it and she offered him a wish as a thank you. Does that make you happy? So employment obligation, it's sort of a joke that's a joke because fairies, what they're supposed to do is grant wishes and do nice things. So when Connor's like, why they always got to show up and grant wishes and do nice things, it's like, that's literally their job. So that's their employment obligation is to do nice things. That's why it says that. But then Mr. Bailey makes up a story that she dropped her wand and the fish gave it back to her. So now she has to do something nice for him. That's better, Connor said. Go on. The fish, predictably, wished for legs so he could play with the boy from the village, Mr. Bailey said. So the fairy turned the fins into legs and he became the walking fish. That's weird, Connor said. Let me guess. The fish was so freaky looking the boy never wanted to play with him? Nope. They became great friends and they played together with the other land animals, Mr. Bailey told him. But one day the boy fell into the lake and he couldn't swim. The walking fish tried to save him, but it was of no use. He didn't have fins anymore. And sadly, the boy drowned. Connor's mouth hung open like a broken glove compartment. You see, if the fish had just stayed in the lake and not wished to be something else, he could have saved the boy's life, Mr. Bailey finished. Dad, that's a horrible story, he said. How does a boy living by a lake not know how to swim? Dogs can swim. Couldn't one of them have saved him? I mean, where was that fairy when the boy was drowning? I think you're missing the point of the story, Mr. Bailey said. Sometimes we forget about our own advantages. because we focus on what we don't have. Just because you have to work a little harder at something that seems easier for others doesn't mean that you're without your own talents. Connor thought about this for a moment. Yeah, I think I get it, Dad, he said. Mr. Bailey smiled at him. Now, why don't we get down from this tree and I'll help you study for that next test. I told you, studying doesn't help, Connor said. I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. It never helps. Then we'll come up with our own way of studying, Mr. Bailey told him. We'll look at pictures of people in your history books and make up jokes about them so that you'll remember their names. And we'll create funny scenarios to help you with all of those math formulas. Connor slowly but surely nodded, and he agreed to it. Fine, he said with a half smile. But for future reference, I like your story about the curvy tree much better. The walk home that day was very quiet. Alex could sense that her brother's presentation had left him a little tense. She tried breaking the silence every few steps with supportive comments, or at least she thought they were supportive. I thought you made a good point, she said sweetly. I mean, granted, it's not a point I would have ever made. Yeah, thanks, Connor replied. She wasn't helping. I mean, you might have overanalyzed it, though, and Alex said. I do it all the time. Sometimes I read a story and I interpret it the way I want to, rather than the way the author wanted me to. It just takes practice. He didn't respond. She wasn't helping. Well, it's our birthday today, Alex reminded him. Are you excited to be 12? Not really, Connor admitted. Just feels like 11. Aren't we supposed to be getting a new set of molars soon or something? Oh, come on, let's be positive, Alex insisted. Even though we aren't doing anything exciting for our birthday, we should stay optimistic. There are plenty of things to look forward to. One more year until we're teenagers. I suppose, Connor said. Only 4 more years left until we can drive. And 6 years left until we can vote and go to college, Alex said. That was all they could come up with. Their cheerfulness was hollow, and they both knew it, so they just stayed silent for the remainder of the walk. Even if they had had the most extravagant party in the world waiting for them at home, birthdays were always going to be hard for them. So think about why birthdays would always be hard. And many of you know because maybe you've lost somebody that you really, really love, and especially if you've lost them right around something that was special. Sometimes people lose somebody around their birthdays or around a holiday. And then every time that event comes up, that birthday or that holiday comes up, you're reminded not only of the person that you love, but now you also remember their death connected to it, and it makes you feel sad. So this is why they're feeling very, very sad. School had been predictable. They walked home, and that had been typical. The whole day had seemed normal. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary to make their birthday feel special at all. Until they got home and saw a bright blue car pulled into their driveway. Grandma? The twins said in perfect unison. Surprise! Yelled their grandmother, getting out of her car. She was so loud the entire neighborhood could hear her. The twins ran up to her with huge smiles on their face. They only saw their grandmother a couple times a year, and they were stunned to see her in their driveway with no prior warning. Their grandmother hugged both of them so tight that they thought they'd pop. Oh, look at you two, she said. Oh, you both look like you've grown a foot since the last time I've seen you. Their grandmother was a petite woman with long, graying brown hair that was pulled back in a tight braid. She had the warmest smile and the kindest eyes in the world, which wrinkled pleasantly when she smiled, just like the twins' dads had. She was cheerful and energetic and exactly what the twins needed. She always wore bright dresses and her signature shoes with white laces and brown heels. She was never more than a few feet away from her large green travel bag and the blue purse. And although their grandfather had died many years before, she always wore her wedding ring. We had no idea you were coming, Connor said. Well, it wouldn't be a surprise if you knew I was coming, Grandma said. What are you doing here, Grandma? Alex asked. Your mom called and she asked me to stay with you for a while when she went to work, Grandma told him. I couldn't let you two spend your birthday alone, could I? Thank goodness I was in the country. Their grandmother was retired and spent most of the year traveling around the world with other retired friends. They traveled mostly to third world countries and read to sick children in hospitals and taught other children of the community to read and write. Come, help me with the groceries, Grandmother told the twins. She opened her trunk and the twins began unloading bags and bags filled with food into the house. It was enough food to last for weeks. Mrs. Bailey was sitting at the kitchen table going through another stack of mail with bright red warning labels on them. She quickly pushed them to the side when the twins and their grandmother paraded into the kitchen with groceries. What's all this? Mrs. Bailey asked. Oh, hello, dear, Grandmother said to her. I'm planning on cooking the twins a huge birthday dinner, and I wasn't sure what you had in the house, so I went to the store and picked up a couple of things. Their grandmother always had a talent for sugarcoating the truth. Ugh. Let me read that again. Their grandmother always had a talent for sugarcoating the truth. You didn't have to go through all this trouble, Mrs. Bailey said, shaking her head, unprepared for the kind gesture. So when they said their grandmother always had a talent for sugarcoating the truth, that means their grandmother knew that there probably wasn't any food in the house because they don't have any money right now, so they don't have a lot of food in the house. So she just said, oh, I just wanted to make them a dinner, and I brought all these groceries just because I didn't know what you had. But she knew that they needed groceries, so she bought more than just what would be for dinner. She brought all of these groceries so that they would have lots of food, not just for dinner, but for other things as well. And she was trying to not make them feel bad, so that's why she said that. Oh, it wasn't trouble at all, Grandma said with a small but reassuring smile. Alex and Connor, how about you guys go get your birthday presents from the front seat of my car, and I'll catch up with your mom for a second. But don't open them until tonight. They happily did as she asked. Presents was a word that had been absent from their vocabulary for a very long time. See, I told you, Alex said to Connor on their way to the grandmother's car. Optimism always pays off. Yeah, Connor said. Half a dozen wrapped presents with bright bows, each marked to one of them, were waiting in the front seat of the car. The twins returned inside with their gifts. Their grandmother and mother were still having a conversation that they most likely weren't supposed to hear. Things are still tough, Mrs. Bailey said, even after selling the bookstore. The house foreclosed, and we still have some debt and things unpaid from the funeral. We're making it somehow. In a few months, we'll be back on our feet. Grandma took Mrs. Bailey's hands into her own. If you need anything, dear, and I mean anything, you know where to find me, she said. You've already helped so much, Mrs. Bailey told her. I don't know where we'd be if it weren't for you. I could never ask you for anything else. You're not asking. I'm offering, Grandmother assured. The twins knew that if they were eavesdropped any longer, they would be caught, so they walked back into the kitchen with their presents. Well, I have to go back to work, Mrs. Bailey said, and she kissed both of the twins on the top of their heads. Have a great night, you guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Save some celebration for me. She gathered her things and mouthed a meaningful thank you to her grandmother on the way out. Grandma put her things away in the guest bedroom and returned to the kitchen, where she found a stack of bills that Mrs. Bailey had put to the side. She plopped the mail into her own purse with a smile, and that was that. Grandma loved helping people, especially if it was against their will. So I think, and tell me if you agree, I think she's going to pay all those bills for them, don't you? Why else would she put them in her bag, right? I think so. Let's get started on dinner, shall we? Grandma said, clapping her hands. Alex and Connor sat at the table and visited with their grandma while she cooked up a store. She told them all about her recent trips and the difficulties she and her friends had experienced in getting into and out of places, and all the interesting people she had met along the way. I've never met a person I didn't learn something from, Grandma said. Even the most monstrous people will surprise you. Remember that. She was cooking so many different things, and it was impossible to tell which ingredient was going where. Everything she did was so fast, and she used almost every pan and dish they had. With every second that passed, the twins' stomachs growled louder and louder, and their mouths salivated more and more. And finally, after a few hours of aroma-teasing torture, they ate. Oh, Alex and Connor had become so accustomed to frozen dinners and takeout they had forgotten how good food could taste. There were plates of mashed potatoes and macaroni and cheese, oven-roasted chicken with carrots and peas, and freshly baked rolls. Their kitchen table looked like a cover of a cookbook. That sounds delicious. I'm thinking about it. I'm going to have a little sip of my coffee. Does that sound like your favorite meal? That sounds like one of my favorite meals. Just when they thought they couldn't possibly eat any more, their grandmother pulled a huge birthday cake out of the oven. The twins were amazed. They hadn't even realized she had been baking one. She sang happy birthday, and the twins blew out their candles. Now open your presents, Grandma said. Oh, I've been collecting for you all year. They opened their boxes and were flooded with knickknacks from all the countries their grandmother had been to. Alex was given a copy of her favorite book in other languages. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in French, The Wonderful World of Wizard of Oz in German, and Little Women in Dutch. Connor got a pile of candies and tacky t-shirts that said things like, "My crazy grandma traveled to India and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." They both received several figurines of famous structures like the Eiffel Tower and the Leaning Tower of Pisa and the Taj Mahal. Wow, she went to a lot of places in just 1 year, don't you think? It's crazy to think that places like this actually exist in the world, Alex said, holding the Eiffel Tower in her hand. You'd be amazed to know what's out there, just waiting to be discovered, their grandmother said with a smile and a twinkle in her eye. A day with very low expectations had turned into one of the best birthdays they ever had. As the night grew later, the visit with their grandmother began to come to a bittersweet end. Since their dad had died, they never saw their grandmother for more than a day at a time, and there were always a few months before each visit. She was so busy with her travels. "When do you leave?" Alex asked her grandmother. "Tomorrow," she said, "as soon as I take you to school." The twins' posture sank a bit. "What's the matter?" asked their grandmother, sensing their spirits sink. "We just wish you could stay longer, Grandma, that's all," Connor said. "We really miss you when you're gone," Alex added. "Things are so gloomy here without Dad, but you make everything seem like it's going to be okay." Their grandmother's constant smile faded slightly, and her gaze drifted off towards the window. She stared blankly into the night sky, and she took a deep breath. "Oh, kiddos, if I could spend every day with you, I would," Grandma said longingly, perhaps more disheartened than she intended to show. "But sometimes life hands us certain responsibilities, not because we want them, but because we were meant to have them, and it's our duty to see to them. And all I can ever think about is how much I miss you two and your dad when I'm away." It was hard for Alex and Connor to understand. Did she not want to travel as much as she did? Their grandmother looked back at them. Her eyes were bright with a new idea. "Oh, I almost forgot. I have one more gift for you," Grandma said, and she jumped up and skipped into the next room. She returned carrying a large old book with a dark emerald cover titled "The Land of Stories" in gold writing. Oh my goodness. Alex and Connor knew what the book was as soon as they saw it. If their childhood could be symbolized by an object, it was this book. "It's your old storybook," Alex proclaimed. "I haven't seen that in years." Their grandmother nodded. "It's very old, and it has been with our family for a very long time," Grandma told them. I take it with me everywhere I go, and I read it to the children in other countries. But now I want you two to have it." The twins were shocked by the gesture. "What?" Connor asked. We can't take your book, Grandma. That's the land of stories. It's your book. It's always been so important to you." Their grandmother opened the book and flipped through the pages, and the entire room filled with its musty paper aroma. "That's very true," said Grandma. "This book and I have spent a lot of time together over the years, but the best times were when I read it to you. So I'd like to pass it down to you now. I don't need it anymore. I have all the stories memorized anyway." She handed it to them. Alex hesitated, but finally accepted the book from her grandmother. It didn't feel right to take it. It was like receiving an heirloom from a relative who was still alive. So an heirloom is something that somebody hands down to you. It's generally something that is handed down from generation to generation. So like a great grandma gives it to a grandma, gives it to their daughter, gives it to their daughter, or something like that. And it's very, very special. It's not always something that's worth a lot of money. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's just something that is super special and important to that family, and that's called an heirloom. Whenever you're feeling down on the days that you miss your dad the most, or when you just wish I was here, all you have to do is open it up, and we'll all be together in spirit, reading along, Grandma told them. "Now it's getting late and you have school tomorrow, so let's get ready for bed." They did as she asked. Even though they were too old for it, their grandmother insisted on tucking them into their bed like old times. Alex took the land of stories with her to bed that night. She gently flipped through the old pages, being careful not to tear them. Seeing all the colorful illustrations of the places and characters again made her feel like she was reading an old scrapbook of sorts. She loved spending time reading about fairy tale characters more than anything. They had always felt so real and accessible to her. They were the best friends she'd ever had. "I wish we got to choose which world we lived in," Alex said, running her fingers over the illustrations. They were so inviting. In her hands was a world unlike the world she lived in. It was a world unaltered by political corruption or technology, a world where good things came to good people, and a world that she wanted to be part of with all of her being. Alex imagined what it would be like to be a character in her own fairy tale. The forest she'd run through, the castle she'd live in, and the creatures she'd befriend. Eventually, Alex's eyelids began to feel heavy. She closed the land of stories and placed it on her nightstand, clicked off her lamp, and began to drift off to sleep. She was just about to fade into unconsciousness when she heard a funny noise. A low humming. It was a sound that filled her room. "What in the world?" Alex said to herself. She opened her eyes to see what it was. She saw nothing. "That's strange," she said. She closed her eyes once more and began to drift back to sleep. The humming noise began to buzz through the room again. Alex sat up and looked around her room and finally found what was making the noise. It was coming from inside the land of stories on her nightstand. And to her amazement, the pages were unmistakably glowing. Oh my gosh. And you know what? It's the end of the chapter. Isn't it amazing how chapters are like that? It's just like when you watch a bunch of, like, you have your favorite show that you watch. Adults call it Netflix binging. It's when you get to the end of one show and they leave you with this cliffhanger, and so you've got to watch the next show, and then that one leaves you with another cliffhanger, and you got to keep watching because you just can't stop reading. You can't stop watching. That's what happens when you watch a television show. Well, books are just like that. What in the world? The book is glowing and humming? Are you kidding me? I thought this was just a story about some twins who lost their dad, and it was so super sad. And I was kind of thinking, like,
Man, first we read The One and Only Ivan, and that was kind of a sad book. Now I'm having kids read another sad book. But this is magical. I can't wait to read more. I'll see you soon.